Welcome to another evening of Town Hall meetings here at Resurrection Parish. I'm Father Tom. I want to welcome you for joining us because it provides an opportunity for all of us to grow in our faith, to grow in being a great neighbor to each other, and to be a person of deeper faith. So this evening is a special topic as we're in January, and a lot of pro-life and issues are coming up, life issues are coming up at this time, that I'd like to go through some of these things. We have a speaker with us tonight as well, who will be introduced in a moment. And we're going to offer this as a time to think about life. What is life around us? Where does it come from? How important is it for us? And how do we live that out in our daily lives? So we're talking about embracing a consistent ethics of life, from womb to tomb, and how we came into this world and how we leave and everything in between. It's a challenging time, and I want to share with you some of the things that are in our diocesan compass between the front and the back pages, because it is all that is in between that is important. First of all, on the front page is a wonderful Oshkosh sister, religious sister, who celebrated 96 years of life. So we want to celebrate with her and recognize the gift that is, as she is able to share that with those around her. I also want to shout out to Father Ripley, who I never knew was a trumpet player, but he certainly knows how to play the trumpet, as they have a band down in Oshkosh going, polka band. Also on page 4, we've got the COVID-19 vaccines. Lots of issues in there as far as whether we receive it or not, receive the vaccine or not, in the news these days. Page 7 has the Supreme Court rules on the sale of abortion drugs, basically whether you can obtain them in person and not in the mail. On the same page, we have the beginning today of the 9 Days for Life. The novena is set up. Again, praying for those in our world who need prayers before birth. We also on page 8, we are better than this, the deacon says, before an execution. Capital punishment, and the federal government, especially at this time, is under fire, and we say our prayers with that. On page 9, Pope calls for health care for all, and how we are dealing with health care in our world, in our country. Page 10, Alyssa Tremblay has an article on building a respect life culture in the family, and she states how they began to do that from the beginning of their marriage and learning about natural family planning. Skipping a page here. Page 15, the Rome University reverses decision to honor priests' pro-life work. Father Frank Pavoni had been up for an award there, and it was pulled back, it says, because a sum of factors, including political situation here in the U.S., as well as ecclesial issues in there as well. And finally, on the last page, we have forces of hate, ignorance with power of love, as we celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. Day this week. The Pope's comment of King's vision of harmony, equality for all remains timely. And again, the whole issue of racism is a life issue as well. As I was thinking about this evening, life is very complex. It's very complicated. It's something we need to know that from the time we're born into this world to the end, there are all kinds of differences. Even though we might look alike, we're all very different. Even though we might look very different, we're not so alike, and yet we are alike. And so there's different issues that come up in many different ways, and there's a huge variance. As again, if we look at the racial issues, the social issues in our world, mental health, cultural, religious, gender, sexuality issues, politics, economics, a huge variance between here and there, and we're trying to figure out how this all fits together, because we know we all like life in little bitty boxes that we can understand, that we can live today. It'll be the same this morning, the same at night, same tomorrow, the same next day. But is life really like that? And finally, also, that life is very vulnerable. There are many situations that we could never imagine ourselves being in, that we can see in our own lives and we can imagine with other people. I just think of a few cases. A 14-year-old daughter of yours turns up pregnant. What do you do? A person in the family, your brother maybe, has ALS, is suffering, has no quality of life. What do? A cousin is on death row. He has an IQ of about 60 to 70. What happens to him? There's a sister is incarcerated for some reason. There's no rehab. These are all life issues, and we don't know how would we respond until we're there, or until we've spoken with somebody in that situation. Again, very few lives fit into a little box that says, this is who I am, and this is where I'm going. That's why we're here this evening, to get maybe a little different perspective on what is life? How do we respect life? How do we know what life brings to us and what we can bring to life itself? And so this evening I ask you to listen, to reflect, to pray with us, to put yourself in another person's shoes and know that everybody's trying to do the best they can with what they have from where they came from and where they need to go. I want to take a moment in prayer and ask for that blessing of God to be with us, that our hearts and minds may be open to that gift, the love of God, and through our church, that we may be a guiding force in our world of deep respect for life in all situations, and in a consistent manner, that we may know God's love that is there for especially those most in need. A special prayer for those at this time in our lives and in our world who are having challenging decisions to make in their life, that we may know, again, that we support them, we guide them, we gift them with our own wisdom and hope as they go through that decision process. And for us as a church, again, that we may be that presence of Christ in our world today, filled with love, compassion, and the joy of the gospel that follows us in all that we do. So I'd like to begin with our presentation for this evening. Susan is going to be introducing Catherine at this time as we hear a great challenge for us and also a gift of life that she brings for us this evening. Susan?
Good evening, and thank you again for being with us tonight. Catholic social teaching embraces the concept of both and approach, life and dignity, rights and responsibilities, charity and justice. Joseph Cardinal Bernardin, one of my personal heroes, if you will, articulated the need for a consistent ethic of life, one that encompasses this approach in the early 1980s. 40 years later, in our polarized atmosphere and context, what lessons can we learn from Bernardin and his framework for a consistent ethic of life? It's my pleasure to introduce this evening a special speaker. Many of you will know her from her work here in the diocese, Ms. Catherine Orr. She is currently serving as the program coordinator for the Roundtable Association of Catholic Diocesan Social Action Directors, and she also ministers as a pastoral associate at Lumen Christi Church in Mequon. Previously, Catherine worked as a diocesan social action director in Summit County Catholic Charities in the Diocese of Cleveland, as a pastoral minister at the Cathedral of St. Columba in Youngstown, Ohio, and as the director of Living Justice here in the Diocese of Green Bay. On a personal note, I worked with Catherine during her time here in Green Bay, and great admiration for her abilities and skills in building relationships and finding common ground, particularly in the early days of the St. John the Evangelist Homeless Shelter and the founding of the Micah Center. In addition, on a personal note, we traveled on a life-changing pilgrimage to the Holy Land and have lots of great memories. So I think Catherine will take you on a great deeper dive in unpacking the consistent ethic of life and helping us reflect and pray together as Father Tom indicated, walking in someone else's shoes for different perspectives. Catherine?
Good evening, everyone. Hope you can hear me all right. First and foremost, thank you, Father Tom, and thank you, Susan, for the invitation to speak here this evening. First of all, I really appreciated hearing Susan's remarks, because we do definitely have wonderful memories from being in the Holy Land and also our work here in the Diocese of Green Bay. And really, my time here in Green Bay was early in my formation and early in ministry, and it was interesting hearing my own biography read by somebody else, because yes, a lot has evolved and changed, and we all continue to grow. But I just really want to thank all of you for the opportunity to speak on what a consistent ethic of life is, especially in the midst of a very inconsistent time. I think many of us over the course of the past year have really been on a roller coaster of emotions and trying to deal with a pandemic in the midst of an election season. It's kind of the perfect storm of trying to figure out which way is up. And for me, I really appreciate the fact that Resurrection Parish really wanted to embrace this topic and to really want to try and dialogue about it, especially coming off the heels of yesterday's transition and inauguration, as well as starting, like Father Tom mentioned, the Novena for Life today, and soon to be, I think, many virtual March for Lives. We talk about life a lot, and it is, like Father Tom mentioned, complex and messy. And where I have found great joy in my ministry for almost 10 years now is trying to figure out how to apply Catholic moral and social teaching to life's issues. So really, throughout the course of our evening tonight, what I hope to try and do is, first of all, just give you a bit more context into who Joseph Cardinal Bernardin is, and who he was as a person, because even though he did not coin the phrase a consistent ethic of life, he really was one of its strongest proponents. So once we get a better understanding of who he was as a person, and also taking a look at the historical context in which he grew up and formation, what was happening in the United States and around the world, will definitely give us a bit more insight into how he developed a consistent ethic of life, and really his willingness to continue to enter into dialogue, which I think is really what we need most at this point in time. So Joseph Cardinal Bernardin, you can all read his biography online, but there are a couple of key points that I really did want to highlight. He was born in 1928, right at the start of the Great Depression in South Carolina, to Italian immigrants. I resonated a bit with that because my mother's family immigrated from Ireland right around that same time, and hearing the stories from my aunts and uncles of what it took to grow up to resettle in a completely new country, not really knowing anyone else and trying to develop community in the midst of great economic strife, I think at a very early age set a tone in his life for a better understanding of what it means to grow up in poverty and struggling. To add to that, Cardinal Bernardin's father passed away from cancer when he was only age 6. And again, reading his biography, that resonated a lot with me because my son is almost 6. And the story that Bernardin continued to share was that he took on a caretaking role of his younger sister at the time because his mother was working as a seamstress. And I think about how trying to, my son, to put him in that situation, to care for our daughter, who's almost 3, is kind of horrifying, but that stuck with him at a very early age, and he had deep compassion for individuals who were struggling. The other key point growing up in South Carolina at the time was that he did continually share that his family was the only Catholic family on his block. In the Baptist South, he learned at a very young age what it meant to work in an ecumenical manner and also in an interfaith way. And that's something that, as we continue on through tonight's presentation, we'll get a better understanding of why that was so important to his ministerial efforts. Fast forwarding a bit, he originally wanted to go to school to become a doctor. And really, I think within the first year of studies in medical school, God was calling him in a different way. So he transitioned to seminary in Baltimore, where he studied philosophy and theology. And later on, he was ordained to the priesthood in 1952. And then fast forward a bit to 1966, he was ordained an auxiliary bishop for the Archdiocese of Atlanta, and at the time was the youngest bishop ordained in the country, he was only 38. So one of the other common threads at the time, because he was so young and put into that leadership role, was he wanted to continue to foster leadership development for young adults working in ministry. He served in this capacity in Atlanta just for only a couple years, because then he was named the first General Secretary of the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, which is now merged and known as the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and again was the youngest individual who served in that capacity at that time. And during his time at the Bishops' Conference, that's really when he was elevated toward a national stage to be able to have a platform to speak about various different issues to a larger audience. And during that time, he also was a strong proponent of and helped start up the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, which is the U.S. Bishops' domestic anti-poverty program. So going back to his time in his early years growing up with economic hardship, that was always near and dear to his heart, and he wanted to make sure that was front and center in the church's ability to be able to help people who were struggling. And just as an aside, a funny little tidbit of trivia, the Catholic Campaign for Human Development is celebrating its anniversary year this year, and it does name its Young Leaders Award after Cardinal Bernardin, so he does have a lasting legacy in that capacity. During this time, though, what's interesting to note, and we'll get to this just in a minute here, but Pope Paul VI in 1967 wrote Populorum Progressio, which is on the development of peoples. And in that encyclical, it really did emphasize various aspects of society and economic development, which is supposed to be able to support the human person and the family, and not the other way around. And it was very, what's the best word for it? Made some waves at the time, especially in the United States, where we really do, we live in a capitalistic society and an upward mobility in part of American culture. And it really did kind of upend how the United States looked at poverty and the economy at the time, of what the dignity of work is, what are the rights of workers, how are they treated, are there safeguards in place, do they have access to health care? What are the universal destination of goods? All of these topics were in conversation at the time, excuse me, that Cardinal Bernardin was having this national stage to be able to try and emphasize these across the country. In 1972, he was named Archbishop in Cincinnati and was there, and really in that time, he really did try to emphasize his ecumenical and interfaith work by working especially with the Jewish population in that area to try and improve relations and work for the common good. It's an area, again, one of the major themes of Catholic social teaching that he was a strong proponent of, and really tried to emphasize that wherever he was ministering. Later on in 1982, and I know this is kind of a quick history lesson here, but I swear it will make sense when we get to the next slide. St. John Paul II named him Archbishop of Chicago in 1982, and then he, a year later, was elevated to Cardinal. In the early 1990s, again, fast forwarding just a little bit, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and had a very public struggle with that for about over a year, and was kind of nicknamed the chaplain of cancer patients at Loyola Hospital in Chicago. And really, he did, at that point in time, said that having that diagnosis was God's greatest gift to him. And he wrote very openly about what the dying process should look like, especially when in conversation there were major conversations around what is euthanasia versus some people trying to say assisted suicide or mercy killing, things like that. And he wrote very publicly on that to say that there is a way to continue to embrace our crosses and to die in a manner that is consistent with our faith. So during this time, and if you want to switch the slides here a bit, I thought it was interesting because I'm a very visual learner, and I appreciated having kind of these key points throughout Bernadine's life next to what was going on in the world and what was going on in the United States at the time. And I reference one in his early years when he was a young child growing up in the midst of the Depression. But really, at the time he was ordained a priest, he had already gone through and lived through World War II, the 1950s. The Korean War was happening, as well as nuclear bomb drills happening in schools, kind of the duck and cover. It was interesting, actually, too. I was, this is a quick aside, researching the life of Cardinal Bernardine because he was in Chicago. My parents are from Chicago, and we are very proud Bears fans there. So I will probably get flack for that one in the question and answer period, but that's all right. But I asked them if they could recall, from a parishioner standpoint, what was their memory of Cardinal Bernardine growing up. And they said how involved he was on a variety of issues and how he was present within the parishes, which was meaningful and impactful to them at the time, especially when there were so many just large threats to life, in particular the Cold War and the nuclear missile and nuclear bomb drills. At the same time, too, he had witnessed and lived through ministry when Vatican II was in place. That was a huge shift liturgically, which I know in Catholic and church circles, we mark that time as a big shift within the church and trying to raise up a bit more of leadership roles within the laity. And there were some challenges within the church institution and the hierarchy about how to implement that. And he was front and center in trying to be able to facilitate a dialogue on how that could happen. In his early years, again, when he was a bishop too, when you look at the 1960s, so much had been happening, especially with regard to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the civil rights movement, which we continue to see how the strife and the fight for racial justice within the country is playing out now, especially coming off the heels of celebrating Martin Luther King Day earlier this week, as well as the Vietnam War. Again, kind of fast forwarding, and I know this is a crash course in history, but I appreciate history because I think it does give a context to really what were the major themes in his life and in his ministry. But in the 1970s, too, it was really, again, coming up on the March for Life, Roe v. Wade was passed in this country, as well as there were advances in stem cell research. So in that point in time, when he did have that early calling to be a doctor and try and understand how medicine was evolving, coupling that with his philosophy and theology and the ministry background, he wanted to try and figure out what were the moral principles and the ethical values that we need to translate to applying them to the research and the advancements that were being made in medicine. Also at the height of the 1980s, it was really when the AIDS crisis was exploding across the country. And within his efforts in Chicago at the time, he started one of the first task forces around the country to be able to figure out and determine how can parishes minister to those who were struggling with the diagnoses, as well as the families who were trying to come to terms with the fact of how a family member contracted this virus, which again fits with COVID in our world now, and how do we try and evolve and support one another when we have to socially distance and wear masks and things like that. So I hope that gives a bit of a context here, but we can move to the next slide. Thank you. It was really in the early 1980s. Again, at this point in time, he had been bishop for several years and within Chicago. And like I mentioned earlier, he did not establish the phrase, a consistent ethic of life, that had been established earlier, but he did promote it and was a strong proponent of it in a variety of ways. And really, one of the first discussions and talks, presentations that he gave on that was at Fordham University. And you can find the talk online as well, and the book on it. There's a collection of his speeches, which is very helpful. And again, if you want to dive deeper into that, you're able to find it. But really, the consistent ethic of life is an ethic for and I'm quoting this here, is an ethic for an age where new techniques brought new challenges to the sanctity of human life. Sometimes the consistent ethic of life is also interchangeably used with the seamless garment, which of course references Christ at the crucifixion, where the soldiers were casting lots for his garments, but his tunic, which was seamless, could not be torn. So they decided not to try and tear it, but they cast lots for it instead. And the idea, the philosophy behind this is that all of life issues are wrapped up in this garment. They are not able to be ripped apart from one another because all life is interconnected. Now, within the institutional church itself, he received a lot of criticism on that, especially from moral theologians who were emphasizing the fact that not all social issues carry the same moral weight. And he spent the vast majority of his career then trying to clarify what he meant by that of course not all issues carry the same weight, but they are all interconnected. And that was the key point that he kept trying to stress over and over again. And really, this consistent ethic of life at the time, if you remember back from the previous slide of what was going on contextually within the world, but the Cold War was at its height at that point in time, and the nuclear arms race was completely ramping up. And I remember having lots of conversations with my father about this because he was stationed in Berlin at the time, which was separated by East and West Berlin. So it was a huge threat to the world, and I think my generation in particular, we forget how big of a deal that was because we did not live through it. But our parents and our grandparents do, and this consistent ethic of life was trying to connect the dots between the fact that a nuclear arms race, having these massive weapons of destruction that could completely wipe out humanity and the earth, multiple times over, is a threat to human life. It's not diminishing any of the other issues and the importance that they carry, but it's just saying that it is connected, because if we don't care about life at a vulnerable stage, we're not going to care about it at other stages. So it has been very difficult. I mean, in his lifetime, he definitely tried to clarify that, and I think there continue to be lots of misconceptions about what the seamless garment and the consistent ethic of life is. But again, it continues to hold true that abortion, capital punishment, again, those two continually try to be pitted against one another, which I think doesn't do us any good, and it actually puts us more at odds with one another. But he maintained that all of these life issues are interconnected, and in the seamless garment, they can't be torn apart. And yes, they are different, and there are different strategies to address them, but they are part of a larger picture that need to be taken into account when looking at the big picture. And I just wanted to share one more quote on this because I think it does help explain and hit home a bit more his point on this. And he says, "A systemic vision of life seeks to expand the moral imagination of a society, not partition it into airtight categories. A consistent ethic of life seeks to present a coherent linkage among a diverse set of issues. It can and should be used to test party platforms, public policies, and candidates for office." Now, right there in that quote, I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions on this, because I don't know about you, but especially if you're working in parish social ministry or Catholic social teaching, I think we can probably count numerous times how many times we've been told Catholics should not be involved in politics. And I do agree we should not be involved in partisan politics, but there is a clear distinction with that, because our framework of looking at being Catholic first should inform and transform all of our lives in how we approach issues, especially the most complex and messy ones. And I think coming off the heels of a very contentious election season, and I know we continue to be very divided, there is wonderful talk of trying to bring unity together, but the talk will fade, and it is going to be hard work. And this is where I think the lessons of Cardinal Bernardin will be able to help us withstand some of the challenges in this. But we do need to be able to be willing to listen and show up to dialogue, and to listen, but to listen and actually hear the person and not try and jump in with your own arguments. And we'll get into this in just a second as well, but I think that legacy, I'll mention this in a few minutes, but the legacy of Bernardine, he didn't create this in a vacuum himself. Like I mentioned earlier, this was informed by the other bishops that he worked with. It was informed by the magisterium and the other popes. And I think also, too, we can see that playing out now with Pope Francis in most of his recent encyclicals, especially with Laudato Si, and that interconnectedness and how all of these issues really are related and going on, especially with his most recent encyclical of Fratelli Tutti, but we'll get into that in a second. So some of the other major themes just wanted to touch on briefly before we get to our questions and question period. Really the big ones that played out over and over again in his discussions were the issues of abortion, the death penalty, ecumenical work, euthanasia, nuclear disarmament, and poverty. Especially in those early years that Roe v. Wade was passed, he was consistent in his approach of saying that all human life is valuable and it must be respected, especially from womb to tomb and everything in between. Being pro-life, I think that unfortunately, working in ministry too, I've seen it over and over again. We try to pit ourselves against one another by saying, I work with a pro-life movement or I work with a social justice movement. And frankly, it's done us a complete disservice to be able to say we're part of the Catholic Church, the universal church that cares about all life issues. And if we're willing to get over ourselves and put our own egos aside, I think we'll be able to understand where the connections are, but also recognize that, yes, all of these issues are diverse and they do require different opinions, or not different opinions, but they do require different approaches on how to handle them. And I'll just give the example of abortion and the death penalty, because unfortunately in his years, those two were always pitted against one another, especially again in the early years of Roe v. Wade. But it was always the argument that an unborn child is defenseless and needs the most important care. And individuals who are on death row, yes, it's a life, but they committed a crime. And how do you reconcile those two? The defenseless, innocent child or the guilty life who made a mistake? And I think that's where it has been extremely challenging, because we've seen over the course of history with the various popes too, and even in the catechism defining the death penalty as saying it's admissible but only in extreme circumstances. The Gospel of Life going on later to talk about how, again, only in extreme circumstances, but it should be rarely used. And now in most recent years with Pope Francis saying it is absolutely inadmissible. So I think it also goes to show that how the church can, over time, evolve in its thinking. And I think it's challenging in certain movements within the church circles because it wants the church to move so fast, and they get angry that the church isn't moving fast enough. And I think at this point in time, we need to be able to be okay with where God has put us in this particular moment and then try and embrace it and determine how best to move forward. And I do also want to add that, especially in the midst of the coming up on the March for Life too, and I'm sure we'll get into this with questions, it is extremely complicated, because I do hope and pray for the day when there's no woman has to make a decision and think abortion is the only option that they have. But again, it gets extremely complicated when you look to some of the reasons of why a woman is potentially considering an abortion. What is their economic situation? What is their family situation? It gets really messy and complicated fast. When you start looking at individual cases, it gets to be a little bit more bite-sized. But as Susan mentioned earlier, our church is about a both-and approach, charity and justice. Yes, we need to help the individual woman make a choice to keep her child, but then how are we going to continue to walk with her to make sure that she has the supports in place to live a life of dignity and to help her child live a life of dignity? So there are no easy answers to this, but I think with Cardinal Bernardine, he was able to, he wanted to be in the middle of those conversations, and I think that's where it gives me hope to be able to try and put ourselves in these situations and truly listen to one another and figure out what are the common goals, how can we try and approach them. And that's where, and this was later on in his ministry, and actually the Catholic Common Ground Initiative really, it started out in, I believe it was 1996, And this was in the midst of when he was already diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. I think he went through one surgery at the time. It was inoperable. He was still trying to continue with his public ministry, while at the same time recognizing that the reason the Catholic Common Ground Initiative started, and it wasn't because of the context of how the church could minister to others within the public, but it was because of the squabbles within the church itself. The document that he wrote that he authored really at the founding of this initiative was titled "Called to be Catholic: Church in a Time of Peril." And that was written in 1996, and that wasn't really that was before the wake of the abuse scandal and the church losing its moral credibility on a variety of issues because of what had happened. So I think about, he's probably got I don't know if he had any foresight, but called to be church in a time of peril, or called to be Catholic in a time of peril, it's just, we're still in the midst of that, and I think we again need to be able to continue to find where we find hope in Christ, and to try and listen attentively to determine how best to move forward. At this point in time, though, he really did recognize a greater need for civility, and I think, goodness, I'm terrible at math, but I mean, 1996, I hope we have learned a bit from then, but unfortunately over the past year of events, I think civility and unity is sorely needed at this point in time, and we need our church leaders and our church hierarchy to be able to try and work for that as well, instead of pitting ourselves against one another, which is causing more confusion, especially within parishes and the larger Catholic community. But really, that great model for respect and listening is what he had hoped for within the Catholic Common Ground Initiative, which really its goal was committed not only to facilitating a dialogue, but also exemplifying a process of communication. Really, within that framework, there were a couple of key points in which he had hoped that the initiative would continue to live out in its ministry, and which it does today. And I'll just read a couple of those at this point in time, because I think they do really ring true and offer us a bit of insight into how we can move forward. The first objective is we should recognize that no single group or viewpoint in the church has a complete monopoly on the truth. And I say this recognizing that I think sometimes we like to stand on our own moral high ground. But I think the reason I appreciate Pope Francis so much, especially when he started in his pontificate, is that he asked for prayers because he was a sinner. And I think it's very humbling that all of us need to remember that we are not God, we do not know everything, and I think I need to remind myself that sometimes. My husband would probably appreciate that as well, that I don't know everything, even though we like to think we do. Second objective is we should not envision ourselves or any one part of the church a saving remnant. No group within the church should judge itself alone to be possessed of enlightenment or spurn the mass of Catholics, their leaders, or their institutions as unfaithful. Again, it goes back to that idea of how are we passing judgment on one another? How quick are we to pigeonhole people into a tiny little box, kind of like how Father Tom mentioned in his opening remarks? It's easy for us to pigeonhole people because then it makes sense in our mind, but ultimately we're doing ourselves a disservice and hurting ourselves in the long run because we're not going to be in better communion with our sister or brother. The third objective is we should presume that those with whom we differ are acting in good faith. They deserve civility, charity, and a good faith effort to understand their concerns. We should not substitute with labels. Again, it goes back to that pigeonholing, how easy it is to dismiss someone as, oh, this person's a radical, this person's doing this. And when we do that, we're not recognizing the innate dignity that that person has as a child of God, who is equally has inalienable rights, just like I do, just like everyone else. We should put the best possible construction on differing positions, addressing their strongest points rather than seizing upon the most vulnerable aspects in order to discredit them. I think this goes back again to listening, and really, are we truly listening to someone when they are speaking to us? Or are we only thinking about what we're going to say next? Or are we trying to identify where someone might have misspoken and pounce on that as an opportunity to discredit them. And I think in those moments, it's very eye-opening of our own intentions, of are we showing up to have a good faith conversation and try and find some common ground. And then the final one he had mentioned here is we should bring the church to engage the realities of contemporary culture, not by simple defiance or by naive acquiescence, but acknowledging in the fashion of Gaudium et Spes both our culture's valid achievements and real dangers. I think here too, this is where we get to take stock of where we're at as a church, where we're at as a nation, where we're at as a culture. Because there are wonderful things that we have accomplished in this year. I think, a former pastor of mine used to share all the time when things seemed very dark and this year had been full of darkness. Find the helpers. Where are the individuals who offer light and joy in small ways? I think this year, most of us have learned not to take for granted the small things, but then also to truly acknowledge where are we falling short and to take an honest assessment of that. And that inward work, that inward looking is extremely difficult to do. Where have I fallen short? Where have I perpetuated an evil? How am I going to change myself? And then to look at that from a systemic perspective is extremely challenging to do because it gets even more complex. But are we willing to show up and have the conversation and figure out how best to move forward? So really, just to wrap it up, because I'm sure there's plenty of questions on this, but the consistent ethic of life has also continued to play out over the last several years, especially with Pope Francis, but even also with previously Pope Benedict. But Pope Francis especially, just to focus the comments just a little bit, it started immediately with his concern for migrants and refugees when he went to Lampedusa, and it continues to be of concern to him. How is that issue of migration and refugees, how is that tied to all of the other social issues? Because really what it boils down to is life, the life of another individual who is struggling, there's violence, persecution, and are trying to do what's best for their family. He goes on to articulate that much more in Laudato Si, and I also reference his most recent encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. So I encourage you all to read those or reread them because I think there are plenty of nuggets in there, and I'll leave us with one of them. And this is from Fratelli Tutti, paragraph 203. Authentic social dialogue involves the ability to respect the other's point of view and to admit that it may include legitimate convictions and concerns. Each of us can learn something from others. No one is useless, and no one is expendable. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak here, and I'm sure we'll have a wonderful discussion at this point.
Thank you, Catherine. If you'd like to come down and have a chair. Tony Pickler is also here. We'd like to welcome you for sharing some ideas and a different perspective as well on where we're at. The last time we did this, we had a rose between two thorns as well. So. Good. So, Catherine, I guess just as you finished up your presentation, how does it feel to go through all of that? I mean, there's a lot of history and challenges, and I'm not sure we're really that much closer to if there is a solution to all this, now than 30 years ago or 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. What does that do for you?
For me, it actually brings a little bit of hope because I love history, and I think understanding history and context hopefully will give us a bit of insight into how we shouldn't be replicating it. And I think that's where, in particular with most recent events revolving around some of the racial injustice that's been happening around the country, this past week we celebrated Martin Luther King Day, and at my parish we had some small group Zoom dialogues about a letter from Birmingham jail, and I was surprised at how eerily similar it sounded. And for me, at first, I was discouraged. My immediate reaction was, how have we not figured this out? How have we not grown from this yet? How are we still having the same dialogues and the same arguments about it? But what I also found too was some great hope in it, because for me, at least I've been able to find more success that there, at least within my own parish, there is a willingness to talk about it, but it requires a space to have vulnerability and for people to feel safe enough to talk about it. And I think that's something that at my own parish, my Human Concerns Commission has been working very hard at trying to be able to create a space where we're able to share our viewpoints without casting judgment, ask clarifying questions, but then really trying to understand what is the person's belief, what is their values, why do they believe what they believe, and to have that space where they can actually articulate it. So I've been finding hope with that, and I think that's where I'm a bit more optimistic, because looking at the history, thankfully at least, I think we have grown a bit. There's definitely a lot of work left to do, but I do think that there are more individuals, if we give them the space and opportunity, they are willing to share more.
Yeah, good, Thank you. It's frightening in a lot of levels. Just speaking of sharing, if you're at home right now, we do have the chat going, so if you'd like to send a message through, we'll be happy to take that and bring that into our conversation as well. Tony, we're just jumping in as you want to. Sure.
It doesn't seem on.
I'll paraphrase.
I was going to say I could share this with you, but it's probably a COVID breathing on this.
I'm taken by, so I've been a big fan of Cardinal Bernardin for many, many years. When I was in college, the two major pastorals from the U.S. bishops, came out in the 83, 86.
Yeah.
The one on economic pastoral.
Yes.
I think Cardinal Bernardin played a huge role in that, right? Thank you. So I think Cardinal Bernardin played a big role in the 1980s documents from the Bishops' Conference, one on peace, and then because of the whole nuclear arms buildup, and then the other on the economy. And I think he played such a big part in both of those. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So the first pastoral, which was directly related out of the nuclear arms race, and I'm referencing just briefly, he did play a huge role in that, because his upbringing and looking at just the information about what a nuclear weapon could do and how it could completely just devastate the entire world. Like, it showed very quickly how it didn't matter if a bomb was dropped in Southeast Asia, there were going to be ripple effects around the world. So it showed on a massive scale how we were interrelated and interconnected. And it actually went back even further than that, because it was with Populorum Progressio on the development of peoples, where it talked about what are the conditions that are needed for an individual and a family to fully develop to be a whole person, to look holistically at what are the conditions you need to thrive, to have dignity. Yes, you need work, you need to have safe work and environment, or in an environment in which to support a family and to raise a family. You need peace. You can't live in a world in which there's constantly chaos, and that's where you start to see also with the refugees. I mean, all over the world. I mean, we are so hyper-focused on our own southern border, but you look at the refugee crisis around the world, it's horrendous in so many other parts. But it's also within Populorum Progressio, which was in the 60s, 1967, I think that truly informed him in pushing forward the economic justice for all at the U.S. level, because it talked very clearly about what are the universal destination of goods, what is the right to private property, how do you have those in comparison to one another, and it really upended the U.S. system, because we were so hyper-focused on increasing our wealth and our capacity, and looking at what are the benefits of capitalism with that. So I do think that he had a huge driving force in developing those documents, which still continue to challenge a lot of people to this day.
I was also really taken by the interconnectedness of life issues. And But one theme that I felt was missing from the list was the environment. Yesterday, President Biden, one of his first actions was to put us back into the Paris Accord, right? And looking at our planet Earth and how we get one shot at this. So why was that, do you think?
Why didn't I put that one on there?
Right, because that's
I
also
swear,
interconnected.
I knew I was going to get that question too.
Why did you mess up?
Why did I mess up? What about not pouncing on people? The reason I did not include that one on there was because in my research, I didn't come across it as much in Bernadine's work in particular. I truly do believe, though, in recent years, that has been a major theme of Pope Francis's. But in some of the earlier writings, it definitely focused a bit more on war and poverty with nuclear disarmament and the economy in that way. So it wasn't to keep it off the list because that definitely is connected to all of our life issues now, and I think Pope Francis has really emphasized that. But I just didn't see that playing out in Bernadine's writings earlier on.
It struck me as you're talking about the differences in polarities, the challenges that we had. There's another word used in there. But anyway, how do we talk? How do we communicate about issues? You bring up abortion, for example, in a room with 10 people, and every first reaction I think is, don't talk about that. It's one of those things. Let's not even talk about it. And I think their choice of words is so important as we do this. I happen to think, in comparison, in the last months there has been a huge defund the police. Defund the police. Well, I mean, it's unrealistic. It's not commonsensical. It's yes, let's look at that. Let's express that. There are challenges, frustrations with that. But if we take all the money away from the police departments, what are you going to do? Right? So it's an issue. It's an important issue. At the same time, to throw language on there that immediately divides, well, that's for those people who think that way. They're going to defund the police, and therefore I'm right and they're wrong. And I think that similarly, I'm bringing it back to abortion, in the sense of, in the Compass, there was a picture of young people in there with signs that said, "End abortion." And I'm thinking, how are we going to end abortion? And we could possibly end the death penalty, because that's a state-driven objective that we can change that, and the state would no longer do that. If somebody else kills that murderer, shall we say, it's no longer capital punishment. It's that person taking it on themselves. So we have some control over that. But I related back to my time when I was in the Dominican Republic back in the early 90s. And actually I went back to visit. And during one of those visits, a Sister Maria down there brought me on a trip into Haiti. And we were driving along in her pickup truck through this barren, treeless area, had a little ravine with a little stream running through it. And there was a tree growing out of that ravine. And she kind of shook her head and kind of mentioned, and a while later I said, "So what? What about that tree?" She said, "Well, that tree, the bark on it, is used to abort. And women come, I don't know if they make a tea out of it, or they chew on the bark, or what they do with it, but it is used to abort the fetus within their body." And again, as I said, if we stop abortion, it's impossible to stop. There's always going to be a way and or an attempt to provide abortions, or to have an abortion accessible to you. Now it can be, I don't know what the challenges are of eating the bark off of that tree for the mother's health and in that situation, and there are other obviously not so healthy situations that people try to remove the fetus in some way, physical way, that is obviously damaging to mothers, so that's an option in there. But to put the language out there again, to say we're going to end abortion, we are going to be in this polarity until the end of time, because it will never end. We can, if we want to say, let's end state-sponsored abortion, or not use tax dollars for abortion, or we can condition it and we can put some regulations on it. That's great. But just to say end abortion is really it continues a polarity, in my mind anyway.
I struggle also with the language that we use is very important, and I think there have been some wonderful benefits that have come out of social media, but I think one of the challenges also is that, especially lately, we try to put everything into 140 characters, and people will only read a headline. Life is so much more complicated than a headline or 140 characters. When you say things like that, you're immediately drawing a line in the sand, whereas you're not having an open-ended question of just saying, what do you love most about your child's life, or what do you love most about life? Having something as simple as an open-ended question about that tries to get people to reimagine, looking at their own lives and assessing, where have I found joy? What things, maybe what was challenging? Who are the people that helped me out along the way? And I find that when we try to just keep things so short, you're not able to fully explain the complexities of life, because I think also too, it would be great if there were like I said before, it would be great if a woman never had to consider an abortion, or would be so desperate and struggling to want to consider that. But I think that, again, turning it back inward and looking at it, where have we as a society then failed to support a woman who is struggling? Where have we failed as a church to support and notice that person? Does that person sit in the back and cry? Do we go up and say hello, or can I help you, or anything? And I think that's where it's tough, because I understand the importance of trying to look at some of the state-sanctioned and the need for advocacy, because I think also too, not to get off track just a bit, but especially with regard to the death penalty too, and I think this is where I've struggled especially a lot in the last several weeks, and I know several months, and I know others have too, is that, again, the state of Wisconsin, I think we took it for granted because we have not had an execution, or there's a moratorium, I can't remember the exact date, in years. But within the last several weeks, there have been 13 federal executions after a 17-year moratorium. And the first woman was executed on federal death row in like almost 70 years, who had been traumatized her whole life over and over again. We as a state have failed on that. Even if within our own state, we haven't had a state-sanctioned execution, at the federal level we have. And I hope, at least I do find a little bit of hope within the administration, because I think we try to focus so hard on where we disagree on things, and we have to find those points of commonality. And I think too, we run the risk when we try to say who's Catholic enough. And I look at, yes, the current administration, the brand new one in. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. So far from it. But where are the opportunities to start a dialogue? What do we have in common? And go from there. And that's where, when it's any issue, whether it's abortion or the death penalty, euthanasia, anything like that, when we even those terms are divisive in and of themselves. Like with my family, or when we were able to gather, you mentioned that, it's like, oh geez, what are we getting into now? Whereas like if we can just have an open-ended question, we'll be in a much better position to actually have an honest dialogue with one another.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of where I was going to go in terms of, because you mentioned passing judgment, and that was such a big part of Bernadine's theories and philosophies, was you just move beyond that. Don't pass judgment. And I just feel like in these last years in the church and in our society and our culture, we're passing a lot of judgment, and we're so divided. And so, so we're day one into a new administration, but we're but we have a lot of work to do. So I guess, you know, maybe even dig a little bit deeper into that, like how, so dialogue being one, you know, way to do this, but how do we move beyond passing judgment so that we do create what was talked a lot about yesterday, and that is unity?
I think the one thing that I found extremely hopeful as well, and it's really funny because, yes, the new president is Catholic, and in my mother's family growing up being Irish Catholic, we joke all the time because at Grandma's house there was a bust of JFK in the house, and it was just because he was the Irish and he was Catholic. That was just, it was amazing, and it was just a source of great pride. And I think if we can focus on, all right, what's our starting point? And as a Catholic, for somebody, what I found optimistic, we had our new Cardinal Gregory. He was able to preside over a prayer service the night before for the victims of the pandemic. Having our new cardinal, who's only African American cardinal within the country, to be able to have that national platform to try and bring everyone together, to recognize the mess that we have been in, but to try and offer some sort of reconciliation and healing, I found that to be amazing. And also the fact that I think the current president, new president, President Biden, went to Mass. The fact that there were so many other individuals within the political spectrum that attended Catholic Mass with him in the morning. I have to go back and listen to the homily from that, but there were definitely elements within that. Like, you know, if I had any question to, you know, ask the current president now, it's like, what about your faith is life-giving to you? Something as open-ended as that. I mean, yes, he's had very public struggles with his own family and politics and all of that. I can't even imagine being in the limelight for that long. But it seems like there's something keeps him connected to the Mass, whether it's the Eucharist or it's the community, something there. And I think that is, in order to do the work of unity and reconciliation, yes, it goes beyond dialogue, but it's also, I think, like I mentioned earlier, creating the space to allow people to be vulnerable. Because there's no way you're going to be at a cocktail party and just, like, you know, sharing your deepest, darkest like secrets and what's, you know, weighing on your heart. But that's why I think the emphasis, and which I have found also helpful during the pandemic, has been small faith sharing groups of really trying to commit to, you know, what did the Sunday scriptures, you know, how did that speak to me today, right now, in my life? What am I currently struggling with? And I've also found that with scripture, ever ancient, ever new, how we are applying it to our lives is where we can really try and focus, because there's commonality in that, even across different faith traditions as well.
So, to get really practical, not that you haven't been, but a day in the life. What does a day in the life of a person who's living a consistent ethics of life, what's that look like? The moment they get up to the moment they go to bed, what does a day in the life look like if you're really living what Bernadine was really calling us to live?
Well, I hope, and I will only give myself as an example because I don't want to speak on anybody, on behalf of anybody else, but where I have found helpful when trying to live a consistent ethic of life, because I don't think anyone ever fully does it. We're all sinners. We all screw up. Myself included, royally. Yeah, never. But I think it starts with gratitude a lot. I think my parents too, growing up, it was always thanking God for another day, just another day. The sun will always shine. There's always going to be a new day. You know, start with gratitude. And then it also starts with prayer, gratitude to God, our Creator. I think the biggest thing that I have found helpful over the years as well, and it's been a very humbling experience too, is that, you know, I am not the end-all, be-all of the world, even though I might think that. But I think that a humble spirit, a meekness, trying to embrace the Beatitudes of what does it mean to be a peacemaker, And this is coming from a German Irish, I mean, how my family tells me I'm stubborn and hot-headed. So it's been a learning experience too. And then really, I think also too, having growth in intellectual formation as well, and trying to continually expand our perspective and having lifelong formation. Because yes, I think we all know, it's especially too with religious education, it can't all be about trying to beat the catechism into someone. The idea of, yes, we can memorize things, but how are we connecting our head to our heart? How is the Spirit stirring you when you talk about some of these more challenging issues? And I think too, one thing that there has been a stronger emphasis of what I've seen across the country too is having a relationship with Christ, and what does that actually mean? And it looks different for people. And I think, you know, in ministry too, we run the risk of trying to tell people like, this is the exact path. So that's why I kind of hesitating. Like, what does it look like? Because it looks like this for me, but that might not work for somebody else. And I think that's where the humbleness needs to come in of saying, well, this is what works for me, and that something else might work for you, but I'll walk with you if you walk with me along the way, and we try and figure it out together. And constantly being, I have learned, adoration was never my preferred prayer form. I think now, as a mom with 2 small kids, I think I really appreciate quiet moments, whereas before, that didn't stir me, that didn't help me, but it might help somebody else. And I think that is why I appreciate our faith and what a consistent ethic of life looks like, is that there are a plethora of ways to do it. You just have to be willing to take the step and commit to trying to do it. And then if it doesn't work, just shift and move on. And ask for help too. I'm terrible at asking for help, but I've learned along the way, can't do it all by yourself.
I have a comment from one of the chats from home. This kind of goes back to the polarity and how do we deal with that in our lives. He said, my issue with the right to life is that most Catholics are so into ending abortion that my life means nothing to them. I have life too. I'm older and I'm feeling neglect. How do we Catholics get those to change how they view right to life?
Wow. No, it's a challenge, but it weighs. I think, you know, even in our own parish experience too, COVID has made it a big struggle for individuals who are older, who are in a vulnerable population, to stay connected and to just be seen. I think of my own parents as well. Older demographic fall within that vulnerable category, some health issues, haven't been doing much, which is a good thing. They shouldn't be. But also to recognize that, you know, they're not forgotten about. And I think that's what's, to that comment, it's extremely sad to hear that, because every person's life has value. And it's not to say that the issue of respecting life and from a particular focus of ending or trying to end abortion and advocate for that. But it's like that person's life is equally as important, and the struggles that go with that. And I think that's where, as a parish community, I've been really proud of ours in terms of simple as a phone call. You know, really trying to get back down to basics and trying to recognize, like, neighbor to neighbor, hey, have you seen so-and-so lately? Has anybody checked in on them? You know, do you know if their kids are bringing them food? Something as simple as that, which I think in the busyness of life prior to the pandemic, we forgot to do that because we filled our days with, I don't know, running around to sports and events and doing, you know, myself included, I was always doing something. And this is forced to slow down, but then it's also said, well, who am I missing? Who haven't I seen? Who haven't I been in communication with? I wonder how they're doing. And I think for a long time, too, it's so easy to get distracted and just say, well, I wonder how so-and-so is doing. I'll give them a call later. Instead of just taking the time right then and there, just if you're able to, just pick up the phone and call the person. Hey, I was thinking about you. How are you doing today?
Right.
Most of the time, it'll be like, hey, I'm great. Thanks for the call. Like, it takes 2 seconds.
Right.
But then there are those that are just like, wow, thank you. And then they'll be able to, again, it's creating that space and an opportunity for somebody to feel like they can share and open up.
I think that's key is that, as you shared before, are there spaces where we can actually listen to each other, converse with each other, and take in new information? You know, it's when we look at our major news media outfits, you got one here, one there, and if I intentionally try to listen to a few of them. If I only listen to one, that's all I'm going to hear, and that's all I'm going to talk about. But if I listen to this one, and then I forget where it was one major event, and I thought, I wonder what they're saying over here on this channel. And I thought, and it was an interesting thing to do, because I was like, yeah, okay, they had their perspective as well. You know, and at one point I thought, they're really gonna go negative on this whole thing over here from that channel, and they didn't. You know, so I was like, you might be surprised by how not so far apart we really are. We really may not be that far apart.
And Bernadine picked up on that a lot of, you know, when we try to pigeonhole people into a particular, like, we're developing preconceived notions and judgments on the other person, which probably aren't accurate. But are we actually creating a dialogue or being open enough to have a conversation with the person and let go of those preconceived notions? Because I think more often than not, we're going to be pleasantly surprised of, oh, maybe we're not as different as we thought. Or you might find, yeah, we have some really different opinions on this, and hey, maybe we commit like once a week. Can we talk about this? Like, and what I've also found too is putting a time limit on some of these conversations is really helpful. I think we shared a while back, you know, starting a conversation with your family at, 2 a.m. after a beer or two is probably not the ideal situation to bring up some of these issues.
Right.
But committing a time where it's like when everybody's together in a sense of like, hey, let's talk about this for like 30 minutes and call it quits. Let it air out, because ultimately you want to continue to have a relationship with the other person because we're supposed to be in communion with them. But if you're trying to beat a dead horse, and again, this is more like taking my own advice, because I always have to try and get the last word, and I always have to try and be right. But it's just like, it's not about being right, and it's not about trying to make a point. It's trying to be in relationship with another person.
So that's going to be our goal tonight, Tony. One of us is going to get the last word.
Not me.
I need to have the last question, so just let me know when that is, okay?
Yeah, how we doing?
Oh, we each get one more question or comment.
Go ahead.
All right.
I can only imagine
So you're
what
going
your
to get
comment's
the
going to
last.
be.
All right. I was struck when on your list that poverty was on there. And it's not the common thing that you would put out there as a respect life issue, or and I guess, can you fill us in with that a little bit more? I can see some connection in my own brain, but what's your thoughts on that?
Yes, so it is a life issue, because when we talk about life and dignity of the human person, again, it goes back to some of the other encyclicals of what it means to fully develop as a human being. It started with Paul VI when he talked about an authentic human development and some of the conditions that you need to have to be able to grow as a person and live a life of dignity. And it's grown over the years, but Pope Francis is the one who continues to talk about. He talks about it a lot in Laudato Si as an integral human ecology of how are we all connected, how are we living the best versions of ourselves. And when you have these conditions that are all out of whack, you don't have a job, you don't have a meaningful job, especially when you start looking at, your family life is in crisis. There's been a fracture there. Relationships are broken. When you look at what a spiritual poverty is, but then also looking at what financial poverty is, especially in this country, it can go into a downward spiral so quickly, and it's hard to get out of it. And I think that's where Bernadine really tried to emphasize that as a holistic approach to what it means to be a person and how to grow and develop. And if you don't have these elements in place, one, you're stagnant, or even worse than that, you're struggling and there's no way to get out of it. So it is a difficult one, because it's, when you talk about, and I'm not a moral theologian, but when you look at trying to prioritize these issues, because not all of them carry the same moral weight, yes, that's true, but it's different sides of the same coin, because ultimately it's talking about what it means to be a human being. And yes, we need to start with life, but how are you living your life? And are you growing? Are you developing? Are you able to support your family? Are you able to grow together as a family? And if those conditions aren't in place, that's where poverty comes in as a life issue as well.
Yeah, because I was thinking, even with education, that there's a trend now that I'm not going to spend all this huge money for this liberal arts education. I'm just going to do the welding part. I'm just going to do this part. I just want the technical ability to go and get a job. And what does that do to the development of the character of that person? And what we're, as a society, what are we offering to our young people as they are educated and gone into the world? What are they receiving along the way?
And it depends, because, and it's so funny you mentioned that that particular example, because my husband is a carpenter, and he is, and I think it's looking at the individual gifts as a person. A liberal arts education for him did not work out, and he's the first one to say that. So if he's listening, you'll be the first one to say that. But for me, if I looked at a technical school, or what he's able to do with, I mean, his creation of woodworking and mechanics and things, I'm just like, oh my gosh, I wouldn't even know where to start. But talking about this kind of stuff, oh, I could do that, whereas that would give him a headache and a heartbeat. But I think that's also where trying to get to know ourselves as individuals, what are our own God-given talents? And they're different, and it's trying to be able to develop, you know, where am I going to flourish with that? And that's going to be different from somebody else, which is great. But the overemphasis, I think, sometimes on what are the skills you have to get a job, then you run the risk of looking at, you know, I'm just a part of the economy. I'm serving the economy, and the economy should be serving me, the other way around. And that's where they talk a lot about that in some of the other documents. And Bernadine picked up on that as well, especially with the bishop's pastoral on economic justice for all.
Right, right. Not just another clog in the wheel.
Right.
Right. Good.
Well, we talked about a lot of heavy issues, life issues, and rightfully so, because, you know, it's really important and really, and it can get really deep really fast. But to end maybe on the lighter side.
I can only imagine where you're going with this
one. You know, when we worked at the diocese together, I lovingly called you Bear Fan.
Yes, you did.
Because you're a Bear fan.
I am.
And I think the Packers were 2-0 against the Bears this year, if I recall correctly. And the Packers are actually playing this weekend in the NFC Championship game.
They are.
So I'm just wondering, as your beloved Bears sit at home on Sunday,
they will be.
Who are you cheering for? The Packers or the Bucks?
Well,
this is a life issue.
This is, yes, it's a life issue, and God forgive me in Green Bay, but go Bucks. And that is...
So you're not going to make it out of here alive.
No, I won't. That is the stubborn Irish German hothead in me giving that response.
We are going to have the police called just so they can give you an escort out of town safely.
But I think, as jokingly aside, this is where we are able to we have had so much, and that's why I've appreciated being here. I've worked with you and Susan for so long, is that we can talk about all of these heavy, difficult issues, but we also can laugh and know how to have fun, and yes, somehow manage to get out of here alive as a Bear fan.
Thanks. Good luck.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure to have you here. It's a blessing just to, again, broaden our sense of life and the possibilities and our thinking. I think our thinking, our thoughts create a lot of polarity, and they could create a lot of coming together in that unity that we're all searching. So thank you, Tony, for being here, Susan for the background stuff, and Jenny and Katie for tech stuff over there. Thank you so much.
Oh, there's one more question. Was there a question?
There's one more question? Oh, boy. Okay, hold on. Can't say goodbye yet?
We're going into overtime.
Hey, as you're getting the question going, for everybody watching, at least, yes, my husband and I, we're a fairly odd couple. We were Bears fans and Browns fans living here, so I think we have weathered our storms of being in Green Bay. We've developed thick skin.
And now you live near Milwaukee, and
yes.
It's not any better.
Exactly.
Good. We talked a little bit about the environmental issue that Tony brought up. You talked about the events in the world as Bernardine was growing up and in leadership. What events in the last 5 to 10 years will have an impact on how we respond to life issues challenging us in our world? So the events in the last 5 to 10 years, what impact might they have?
Wow. Well, I think, from the church's perspective as well, there have been, for all of us working in ministry, I think the abuse crisis and the challenge that the failure of leadership to act accordingly has clouded really ministry for that entire period. Since I have been in ministry, it has always been a shadow of all of that. And because I really try to focus very heavily on being Catholic first and looking at and how my faith informs world events, that one for me has been the biggest one that has really, I think, been very humbling. It's been frustrating. So many different emotions of, again, how have we not figured this out? And I really do think that one in particular, but also...
I'm sorry, I spaced out. What was the issue?
Oh, the abuse crisis within the church. And
abuse crisis.
The abuse crisis within the church.
Okay.
But I also think, too, and this is where I might get into some fun conversations with my own family and the big military history, the service that they all have, but I think the longevity that we have had of fighting a war for so long, we have become so desensitized to violence in our country and in the world. And again, coming from, my father served in the Army for 22 years, and lots of individuals in my family are still part of various branches of the military as well as in law enforcement too, but we have become very desensitized to really the sacredness of life and how fragile it can be. And I think coupled with the abuse crisis and how we really preyed upon individuals as a church and how we failed to protect individuals who were vulnerable, it just goes to show that those are the two big ones, I think, in my life that, especially in the most recent years, that have really tried to help frame my reference into how we move forward, really in a humble way, but in an honest way, and trying to find common ground on that.
I would add the social media and the fast communications that happens between us and among us. And as we're watching more and more the idea of radicalizing, being radicalized, that it is, in a sense, so easy for those to put out a very strict sense of this is life and everything else is bad, and for us to plug into that if we choose. And that seems to be a big challenge. Along with, on the positive end of it, is we just have a lot of information to sift through and to understand in a very short time.
Yes, and that's what's hard because, if we're actually take the time for prayer and reflection, which everybody should try and do daily, and try and just disconnect and be in quiet prayer to try and hear where God is calling us to be. It's really hard when you're getting notifications on your phone or on your smart device, and I think that's why as we're coming up on Lent, that's something that I'm going to try and intentionally be much more aware of. What is my screen time? What example am I setting for my kids on this? Because it's hard to keep up with the rapid pace of information, and for my own experience, gosh, I can barely keep up with all of it.
Yeah, I mean, just church-wise, writing an encyclical, writing, developing an informed conscience of whatever issue coming up takes time. You know, I mean, back in the day, I'm talking 500 years ago, but it took a letter to get, months to get from here to there, and then another month or so to go to here to there, and by maybe a year later, you might have some kind of response and coming together of something. That could go on like 100 years of discussion on one particular issue, versus today, people want an answer 5 minutes later, and I want it in how many
140 characters.
140 characters, and then even beyond that, I'm not going to listen. So yeah, that's a real challenge to be able to keep up with all that's happening. Yeah, all of a sudden.
What about you? What do you think? What are your big issues?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking social media as well, and I think of the book Megatrends that talked about how the more we become, socially connected with each other, we become disconnected in a way, and so we need to have more like physical connections, so we can know people across the world and we can communicate with anybody in a matter of seconds, but yet we don't necessarily know our neighbor. And so I think, to me, that's like the biggest question is like and it comes out of Fratelli Tutti now as well, right? That the biggest question, who's our neighbor? And is our neighbor only the person who looks like us, who thinks like us, who's in the same political party as us, who goes to our church, or is our neighbor people that are completely opposite of us, or people we don't know, people we would never rub elbows with at a party, So to me, that lack of connection, the connection but lack of connection in terms of real relationships is a huge issue, and it's just kind of made more prevalent because of technology.
Well, and one of the things too, and I don't know if you have seen this in your own parishes, but because of COVID, we've been doing so many different of our commission meetings and things. They're all done virtually via Zoom. And one, I've been pleasantly surprised that my participation of my committee members has really gone up because they don't have other things going on. So that's been they don't have an excuse to miss out, which has been great. But I've also been really pleasantly surprised at how people are much more willing to be vulnerable via Zoom, which to me is surprising. And I don't know if it's because they're in the comfort of their own home, if there is just because it's on a screen, maybe there's just some level of distance where they are a little bit more comfortable, but I was surprised by that.
Right before this, I was on a board call with Foundations, Health and Wholeness, and they were reporting that their numbers of their counseling sessions is up during COVID. It's all telehealth, right? But interestingly enough, and something they can explain, they have to study more, is that the effectiveness of those sessions has increased. So very strange that somehow through a screen, the effectiveness went up versus face-to-face. A lot more studies going to have to be done on that. A lot more, yeah. Because, I mean, it upends also of being able to, see individuals and be in person where it's that's where you want to have that dialogue and that back and forth. But, yeah, I can't explain it, and it's a mystery.
So should I put my vote in for Zoomed confessions?
Yeah.
There you go. We'll see what the Holy Father has to say about that.
Yeah. Try that.
Or at least the bishop.
I haven't been saying Mass for a few days because I'm on vacation. I'm on vacation now. But somebody else's ear has been in this thing. And it's not formed to my ear anymore. That's why it keeps falling out. So, okay, good. I think we could go on for another half hour or so, but let's call it quits. I hear the bells ringing outside for something. Again, thank you all for coming in, and it's a great discussion to have. Maybe some of what we've been doing can carry over into your own relationships, family-wise, friend-wise, church-wise, and maybe we can get into a more consistent way of understanding life and respecting life in all ways. God bless you all. Thanks.
And thanks, Bear fan.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Go Bears some year, but not this year.
Go Pack,
not
go.
this year.
Go Pack, go.
Thank you.